Welcome to My Comic Shop Book Club. I am your host, Anthony Desiato. Our convention talk will resume in September, but summer belongs to the sub-series. First up is a 2-episode Superman Book Club event. In this installment, we will be tackling the 5 major post-crisis tellings of Superman's origin. We're talking Byrne's Man of Steel, For All Seasons by Jeph Loeb and Tim Sale, Superman Birthright by Mark Waid and Leinil, Secret Origin by Geoff Johns and Gary Frank, and American Alien by Max Landis. Joining me for this episode, and the next episode as well, is a returning guest, a Flat Squirrel favorite, 13th Dimension's Dan Greenfield.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Welcome back, sir.
Well, thank you for having me. Anytime I get a chance to talk about comic books, I'm going to take it.
Yeah, the last time we did a book club episode, we were also joined by Mike San Gregorio. We tackled the entire 7-year Grant Morrison run on Batman. That was a lot more homework.
That was a lot of homework. Yeah, that was a heavy lift. It was fun though, because I had, that was something I'd always wanted to read in one sitting. And even though I didn't get to do it in one sitting, it took me a couple of weeks to get it done. There was a lot there. This was different because everything, the perspectives and points of view in all of these different stories are quite different. So I think it'll be a different approach.
Yeah, I mean, this could maybe be another book club episode at another point, but just as a quick follow-up to the Morrison one, it was an interesting experiment going through that entire run. You know, as we discussed in that episode, Morrison can be kind of challenging and it can be a lot of work, getting through everything, but I really had a good time with it. And then after that, I went back and I revisited Final Crisis, and I read the whole thing in one sitting, and I enjoyed it and appreciated it a lot more the second time. There are still things that I think could have been a lot better about it. I didn't think it worked completely, but I definitely enjoyed it more. And so now I'd be open to revisiting some other Morrison stuff down the line, I think.
Well, the funny thing that we're not talking about here is All-Star Superman, which, of course, is its own thing and has the most brilliant telling of the Superman origin perhaps ever in one page.
Yes.
Just, what is it? The four panels in one page, I think it is about... it really gets to the heart of the matter. But anyway, we've got 5 stories here with a lot more detail to talk about.
Someone actually made that exact point when I posted on Facebook that I was going to be doing this book club episode. Someone actually wrote the best origin is the first page of All-Star Superman. Yeah, so it's true. So while we're,
because really it's, and this will be kind of a theme, I think, in some of the things we'll talk about here is, it really does get to the heart of what you need to know about Superman, because there are just some basic tropes that are key. It's the details and what you prefer, in those details, I think has a lot to do with what kind of Superman fan you are.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I also want to thank you, before we get into this, for the opportunity to write an article for 13th Dimension during Superman Week a couple months back.
Superman Week was fun. We did, for anybody who's listening, you can go back to 13th Dimension and look up Superman Week in the search window. We did a lot of coverage. And yeah, Anthony's piece was terrific about sort of the legacy of Superman and why he endures after 80 years. It was one of the favorite things that I published that week, and we had a lot of other good stuff in there as well. Plus, Dan Jurgens wrote a piece for us, which was great, and we had a lot of good, artists talking about different Superman and Action Comics covers, and that was something that was one of the happiest things I've done this year. That was really great, and the response to it was phenomenal.
Yeah, I was honored to be asked, and when you gave me the assignment, it took me a second because I incorporated this into the article, for almost my whole life. Anytime anyone says, who's your favorite character? It's automatic. It's Superman. Right. And it's like, yes, over the years I've thought about why, and I could articulate a few reasons, but to actually sit down and come up with 13 concrete reasons, but it was such a valuable exercise as a writer, as a fan. Like it was a process that I really enjoyed, and, people can read the article if they want, but, one of the things that I included in that was that I really feel like it's a very tired argument, and I don't want to hear it anymore, about Superman not being relatable. He's too powerful. It's hard to come up with credible threats. He's too godlike. Because to me, it's always been this young man trying to find his place in the world, and it's universal. And as I wrote in the piece, I wouldn't argue that he has a more compelling origin than a Batman or a Spider-Man. I mean, I wouldn't go that far, but as far as him being relatable, it's there. And I'm excited that we're talking about these works here, because I think all of them in their own way, some more so than others, really get at that idea.
Yeah, I agree. And I would actually say his is as compelling as Batman and Spider-Man as far as like the top origin stories that you think of, because it is archetypal. You know, as Morrison, as we were just saying, pointed out, 1 page, 4 panels, I think it was. That's it. And it is that crux, the idea. And it, you know, I mean, we can, and I'm sure we will, you can go on to the issue about it being a metaphor for the immigrant experience, the idea of, you know, assimilation, the whole idea of truth, justice in the American way. But all of that coming from that idea of the exploding planet, put him in a rocket, send him to Earth, and then he becomes Superman is, you know, it's the classic American myth. So.
All right. So we talked ahead of time about kind of tackling these books, you know, thematically, because they hit a lot of the same beats, but sometimes in a different order or different way with their own spin. So we'll be really organizing our conversation that way rather than going book by book. But if you're game, I thought maybe we could just go through each one quickly, like just to give a hot take on it.
Absolutely.
Would you like to kick us off with Man of Steel?
Absolutely, because Man of Steel was what made me a Superman fan in the comics. I was 19 when it came out. It was 1986, and I had not. I'm a Batman fan, not a big Superman fan growing up. I mean, I liked him because he was a superhero. He wore a cape, flew around, did cool stuff. But it wasn't like, you know, I watched the George Reeves show somewhat. Was certainly familiar with Super Friends, all of that kind of stuff, and I had some comic books that were Superman comics, and of course I knew him, you know, through World's Finest, also in the Justice League. But the Superman comics never really spoke to me, and what really changed everything for me was Superman the movie, which I saw when it came out. So I was 10 years old, or thereabout, 10 or 11 years old. And that changed everything. I completely understood Superman's appeal. I completely understood why he was a big deal. But even then, and what it did do is that it made me then go back and reevaluate the comics. Go get some comics. Let's get into Superman. Let's give this a try. But the comics left me cold. It just didn't speak to me for whatever reason. And so when Byrne, you know, when they announced that Byrne was taking over and that they were going to revamp Superman's origin and that it was going to be this whole ground up, you know, redo, I was really excited. I figured here's an opportunity for me as a fan to really kind of jump in on the perfect jumping on point. And we are so accustomed to reboots now. This was historic. This was in 1986. This had not been done before. There had been, you know, over the years, of course, there was Earth 1, Earth 2, Golden Age, Silver Age, but that was more of an evolution. This was, here we are, we're throwing out the old, we're putting in the new. And a lot of people were upset by it, but I was really excited by it. So when it came out as a bi-weekly miniseries, and they put a pause on Superman in Action Comics and you know, that year, and had this come out, I was really excited. And it was, for that summer, my favorite comic book. I was, you know, I eagerly awaited for the next issue, and to this day, it remains my favorite take on Superman in the comics. And part of it is because it adheres so much conceptually to what Superman the movie is, in terms of stripping down the origin, kind of limiting his powers to a certain degree. It's the way it regards his relationships with Lois Lane and Lex Luthor, and Metropolis in general, the way it handled his relationship with his parents. So for me, the Man of Steel is still the benchmark of all of the Superman origin stories.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought all of that up. I was going to ask, you know, what it was like reading that at the time when it came out, because I think it's important. I mean, for all of them, but especially that one, putting it in its proper context. You know, on the heels of Crisis on Infinite Earths and this new version of Superman. And I mean, for someone who had read Superman previously, I know, you know, it didn't really connect with you as much, but I mean, I would imagine, I mean, this was such a departure, right, from everything that had come before. It
was, and I was aware of that because what had been, and this isn't to. I don't want to put too fine a point on it, because I don't want anybody to be insulted if they're big Bronze Age Superman fans or Silver Age Superman fans, because those fans are very, and rightfully so, protective of that version of Superman. It just didn't work for me. It just wasn't something that appealed to me. But Man of Steel, and the first couple of years afterward, when Byrne was still on the books, and, you know, Wolfman and Ordway were on the other books, and you know, they had Action become a team up, and it was all really, really, really exciting. And it was probably the high point of my Superman fandom. But that summer of the Man of Steel, it was like watching a miniseries. I mean, you looked, it was appointment reading. I couldn't wait to get to the store. I looked forward to it. I read it and reread it. And I loved the new version of Krypton. I loved the notion that he was never Superboy. I loved the way his idea of Clark Kent was. I love the way, and I still to this day, and there are so many great artists out there who have done Superman. I don't know if I can say that John Byrne is the best Superman artist ever, but nobody's better. Anybody else you can find out there, in my opinion, is as good, maybe, Gary Frank being a real great example. But Byrne, to me, visually also gives me what I think of when I think Superman in my mind in the comics. It's what John Byrne drew.
Talking about that experience of reading it as it came out, in our next episode, a little preview for listeners, we'll be tackling Bendis's Man of Steel, which is coming out weekly this summer. And perhaps there's someone out there now, some youngster who's having a similar experience this summer.
Well, you hope so.
Yeah, Yeah.
That's what, I mean, and that sort of was the impetus to kind of do this was because of Bendis taking over and kind of taking stock in Superman. And, the way they brought in Bendis was very much like John Byrne. The Bendis is, we'll talk about this more in the next episode, but Bendis's defection was as big a deal as John Byrne's was in the mid 80s. And in the same way that Kirby was in the early 70s. There's a real through line there. So it was no accident that DC decided to kick off Bendis's run with a 6-issue miniseries called The Man of Steel, using the exact same font for the logo. And the difference there is that, as we'll get to, that's not really an origin story. It kind of tinkers with the origin, but it's not really an origin story. But The Man of Steel certainly sure was, and it wasn't like Batman Year One, where it was 1 year. It basically takes, I think it's like a 10-year.
Yes, they do cover a lot of ground.
Yeah, 6 issues in 10 years or something like that.
Yeah. So I had only ever read, believe it or not, Man of Steel once before.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's weird. Wow. I don't know. Yeah. So I enjoyed revisiting it, and I definitely enjoyed it more the second time. Man of Steel kind of falls into the category for me of a book that I respect and appreciate more than I necessarily enjoy the reading of it. However, I would count this as probably the most important of all of these ones that we're talking about. And, for me personally, I started with Superman in 92. Byrne was not doing Superman at that point, but the Superman I was reading, that was Byrne's Superman. That was the one that he established. So, it definitely carries a lot of weight for me. We'll jump to For All Seasons. Huge Smallville fan, as you know, and as listeners know, I've talked about it basically any chance I get. So it's probably not surprising. For All Seasons is one of my favorites because, we spend a lot of time in Smallville. So much of it is about him leaving Smallville, leaving the farm, and then coming back to it at these points of loneliness or doubt. So I enjoyed it a lot. For me, it was probably the most emotionally resonant, and I'm not surprised because Loeb and Sale, I think, do that extremely well. We saw that with the Marvel color books. Spider-Man Blue and Daredevil Yellow in particular are ones that I really enjoyed. So For All Seasons, again, probably on an emotional level, I connected with the most, and it was interesting. Each chapter representing a season and a different perspective, right? So we had Pa Kent, we had Lois, Lex, and Lana. So seeing Clark and Superman through their eyes, I enjoyed it a lot. What was your take on?
Well, it fits in with, because of the time that it came out. DC hadn't let it become a runaway train as far as Superman's origin was yet. They still were adhering to Man of Steel being the origin, so For All Seasons fits in.
It really does,
It's written very much with Man of Steel in mind, and it basically fills in the blanks. And like you said, it's emotionally resonant. More than all five that we're discussing here, it is easily the most emotionally resonant. It's the most personal of all of the stories. And in part, I think it's because they're not trying to reestablish the origin. They're trying to fill in the gaps and amplify certain parts of Superman's character, particularly the Clark Kent aspect of his character. And you're right, the Smallville aspect of his upbringing. But it's basically Superman Year One, where it's told in 4 seasons. It's written with very clear callbacks to Man of Steel, particularly the Lex Luthor stuff. But it makes it so that all fits in and doesn't contradict anything. So I appreciate it for that. It's also one of the most beautifully colored books I've ever seen. Bjarne Hansen being the colorist. It's just beautiful, especially again in Smallville, the scene where Clark and his father are standing out in the field, and the son says, "Did you ever get tired of this?" He goes, "No," and it's just beautiful, and you could just imagine, just standing there like that, and how fulfilling it is to be in Smallville, and it gives Smallville a sense of character and a sense of, not scope, it's the opposite of that really, but it gives a sense of why it's so important to Superman and his upbringing to have Smallville as part of his background.
Yeah. So now shifting to Birthright by Mark Waid. So now this was a new telling of the origin, not something to fit in with what had previously been established. Well, I'm going to get your take first.
I didn't read it as it came out. I read it in trade. Actually, I read For All Seasons in trade too, because they both came out, while I was Birthright at the end, but For All Seasons came out when I was on my personal comic book hiatus, which was about a 10-year period.
Yes, which we discussed in the very
which we've
first,
discussed. Way back. Yeah, right, exactly. But it was that. So I read both of those in retrospect. Which is good because actually For All Seasons works especially well in one sitting. Birthright I liked, but I had problems with it because, and this is where we're going to get into a thematic issue that I think is a lot of superhero stories now in all sorts of media, but particularly Superman, is that I didn't think it was necessary. It was not a story I thought that needed to be told. I thought that, and I still cling to the idea that Man of Steel covered all the bases that needed to be covered, and I didn't think there was any reason to go back and redo it. It was still fresh in my mind. And because, if you remember, my comic book thinking was on the pause button.
Right.
For me, Byrne was still it when I left comics, and so when I came back, I assumed Byrne was still it, and Byrne was no longer it at all, not even close to it, when where Superman was concerned anyway. So I read Birthright, and it kind of confused me. As I read it like the first time, I thought, why am I reading this? I'm not sure I understand what the point of this is. We have a perfectly legitimate origin story. Do we really need another one so soon? So everything I read about Birthright was in that kind of, from that perspective. It's not fair to the book at all. It's not fair to the effort that went into it, Mark Waid and Leinil. It's a perfectly fine Superman origin story, but it doesn't speak to me because it'll always be that thing that kind of intruded on something for me that never seemed, it just never seemed necessary. Although I do like some of what it brought to Superman's world.
I've had a big smile on my face as you've been saying all that, because it's interesting to me, again, these personal connections that we have with these characters and stories. So for you, you really connected with Man of Steel, and then Birthright comes along and it's like, well, we don't need this. For me, again, I didn't have that connection with Man of Steel. Right. Birthright came along. It's my favorite, and I'll talk about why. And I'm just going to jump ahead for a second. When Secret Origin came around, I felt Secret Origin was the most unnecessary out of all of these. So the experience that you had with Birthright, that was me with Secret Origin, where I'm like, no, we have the definitive origin that just came out a few years earlier. We don't need this. Well,
I think there's also an age thing that's going on here too, because it's a common discussion point that when you experience certain things in comics at certain ages and at certain times, and you love your first, you love what you loved when you were 10 or 12 years old.
Right.
Those rose-colored glasses come on, and I think that also helps. With when it comes to Birthright, it was one of those things. I kind of think of it as the comic book version of the movie The Amazing Spider-Man, where you just had 3 movies that told the Spider-Man story. And here we go again, starting over from scratch. And I'm thinking, this movie's fine. I certainly like the Gwen Stacy bit. I like Emma Stone, and Andrew Garfield is a fine Peter Parker, and I'm enjoying myself watching this story. But I'm thinking to myself, why did they do this? They didn't need to tell another origin story. They just could have had it be Spider-Man mid-career. It didn't have to have anything to do with Tobey Maguire. They could have said it's a reboot, made other cosmetic changes, and moved on. It's sort of also how I feel about the movie The Man of Steel. And again, not to get too far off the point, but I watched that movie, and despite my other substantial issues with that movie, also, I thought to myself, why do we need it to be the origin when we know, again, going back to Grant Morrison's one page, everybody knows what happened. Everybody knows Krypton blew up. Everybody knows he came here in a rocket. Why do we need to see this again as a movie? I know that's somewhat apples and oranges, but that's always been my take on Birthright. But again, that's not to say that it's not a good comic book, because it's obviously very well done, very professionally told. From a story standpoint, there's parts of it that don't really appeal to me, because I really do prefer kind of a different vision of Krypton and where Krypton's role in Superman's makeup, as it were, and how much of his story should be. So I'm of the mind that the best Superman stories have very little to do with Krypton, very little to do with him going back to Krypton or thinking about Krypton. Krypton was where he came from. Krypton is no longer there. It's part of his legacy, and elements of the Fortress of Solitude, of course, is where he goes to get his Krypton on. But I prefer the stories where he's more, well, I mean, he can be off in other parts of the galaxy or whatever, but I mean, just living in the now, I guess, is the best way. And that, so when I see something like Birthright, which kind of leaned heavily on the Krypton stuff, it just doesn't interest me from a taste issue.
Fair enough. So, one of the themes I want to talk about is Krypton and its role in Clark's origin story. But just as a quick side note, you mentioned Man of Steel. For all of its shortcomings, and we could do a whole other podcast on that and the whole Snyderverse, but for whatever reason, it was the first time, Man of Steel was the first time that the Krypton portion of the story really worked for me. And I don't know if it was the visual aesthetic or Russell Crowe's performance.
That's what
probably
that was what it is. I thought he was the best part of the movie.
And that was the first, because every time, whether it's honestly any of these, and again, not all of these books that we read even show Krypton. In fact, only a couple of them do.
Right.
But even if it's Superman the animated series or Superman the movie, that's always the part that I'm just kind of like, all right, we got to get through this before we get to Smallville, which is where I'm like, all right, here we go. But Man of Steel was
for me, it's Metropolis.
Fair enough.
I really prefer the whole Metropolis thing, but go ahead.
Yeah.
Although I watched every episode of Smallville, too. I watched all 10 years of it. I was there right with you there.
All right.
Anthony. Yeah.
But yeah, so Man of Steel was the first time where I was like, okay, like this like I just connected with it, and I was really engaged with it. As far as Birthright, see, for me, the reason why I felt it was necessary was I felt it finally took the time to explain why Clark would adopt the costume and this other persona. I felt like the other stories accounted for why he would want to use his powers for good. Like, that's addressed in pretty much all of them. But as far as actually making this decision to put on that costume and have the dual identity, I felt like it was the most complete and realistic treatment of that. The other thing that I really liked, and one of the themes I want to talk about, is the depiction of Clark. Birthright's my favorite because I feel I liked Byrne's Clark, but he might be a little too confident and assertive.
Sure.
But then on the other extreme, we have, the Secret Origin take, which is very much informed by the Christopher Reeve, Richard Donner movie. And in that case, while I love Reeve's performance, and I think it does probably the most convincing job explaining why people wouldn't be able to tell that they're the same person, I don't particularly care for like the bumbling Clark. I much prefer the idea that he's more just unassuming and dull and just kind of trying to fade into the background, as opposed to like knocking everything over and being the center of attention in that way. So for those reasons in particular, and others as well that we can talk about, again, Birthright just worked for me. It was my favorite. But like I said, jumping to the next one for our hot takes, I felt Secret Origin was the least necessary. And it breaks my heart to say that, because I've enjoyed a lot of what Geoff Johns has written, especially the first chunk of his career at DC, the Flash run, bringing back Hal Jordan, bringing back Hawkman, the way he revitalized JSA with Goyer and James Robinson, all of the bringing back Teen Titans. Those are some of my favorite comics, my favorite runs. Some of the more recent work I haven't connected with as much, and Secret Origin sadly falls into that category for me. You mentioned Superboy before. As much of a Superman fan as I am, I do not care for the concept of Superboy. I don't
We agree there.
Yeah, I don't like the idea that he'd be putting on the costume and flying around in Smallville.
Right.
I also, and so that's something that Secret Origin reinstated, as well as Clark's time with the Legion of Superheroes. Mm-hmm. I get the appeal. Like, I really do. Like, I understand why people would like this and why this is something that they might want to bring back. But I feel like him having those adventures at that point in his journey kind of undermines his overall story and path. So I really didn't care for those two things being reinstated. And the rest of it, I really didn't feel like it offered us... Again, it just didn't feel necessary to me. What was your take?
I liked it a lot. And part of it was because this also came at a time for me when... And again, talk about things that we've talked about before, things that I've written about, when I was much more hung up on continuity. It was very frustrating 10 years ago, I thought, particularly with Birthright and when Infinite Crisis came along, to figure out when you're reading Superman comics at that point, I was more hung up on the idea of needing to know what Superman am I reading here? If they're tossing out Man of Steel and then they bring in Birthright, but then they took out Birthright, it felt like almost as quickly as they put it in as far as canon.
Yeah.
And then they went years without really kind of telling you, and not that it mattered. And a lot of this also was paralleled with the legal issues over the name Superboy and the character Superboy. And that was informed by a lot of this also. So that when they finally came back and Geoff Johns took over the character, first off, Johns' run on Superman up to that time was the closest I had read to what Byrne had been doing. Not in terms of the details of whether he was Superboy or whatever, but in terms of, to me, writing the kind of Superman that I would want to read. And of course, even more than Byrne's, was really influenced by Christopher Reeve. I mean, of course, Geoff Johns used to work with Richard Donner. He still has a connection to him. But there are scenes in Secret Origin, first off, the way Gary Frank draws him. He's drawing Christopher Reeve. Let's not kid ourselves. He's also drawing Margot Kidder. Everybody else looks like your typical, archetypal versions of those characters. But he's drawing, those two when he's drawing Superman and Lois Lane, particularly Superman. But so I appreciated that. It's interesting to reread it because at the time I really enjoyed the fact that he rescues her and he catches the helicopter and he's bringing Superman the movie and that whole world into Secret Origin. Now, though, I read it as I was, getting ready for this, it kind of reminds you that it's not as good as Superman the movie. That the lines and scenes that they use, the one-liners in Superman the movie are so good that when they do their versions of it, like she says to him, "Who are you?" And, in the movie he says, "A friend," which is a great, simple answer. Here he's like, "Oh, I'm just someone who wants to help." I'm like, no. A friend is the right answer to that. It's just in terms of the how lyrical that those lines of dialogue are. But I still like the story. I like the fact that I prefer, more than I did in Birthright's version of Lex Luthor, I prefer this version of Lex Luthor. I still think that the Man of Steel's version of Lex Luthor is the best of them all. And not to sound like a broken record, but how Lex Luthor handled is actually kind of a big deal to me. And the version, and we can talk about that too specifically.
Sure, yeah.
But I like the way Luthor's handled, and the way that Geoff Johns does a lot of his work is that what he tries to do is he tries to pull the best of all versions of Superman or any character and then put them together, so that it's not quite as exclusionary. And where Secret Origin is a real testament to that. But I agree with you 100% about Superboy and the Legion. I'm sorry to the fans who love the Legion, and the Legion is fine. Keep them in the 30th or 31st century or whatever. Maybe they could be inspired by Superman. Maybe they can be, have met Superman himself at some point. And I do understand that if you're so invested in those characters and those kinds of stories, you don't want to see them fade away into nothingness. I completely understand that. I just prefer it that he wasn't Superboy. It works better because just the whole notion that this kid in Kansas, I know we're not supposed to think too hard about this stuff because the whole idea, it's not plausible that a man can fly and do all this kind of stuff anyway. But the idea that nobody would make the connection that Superman was in Smallville and then some in this tiny town with only so many people in it. And then all of a sudden he shows up in Metropolis and nobody kind of starts drawing any comparisons or conclusions that, gee, now who from Smallville might have moved to Metropolis and who might have, it would be, especially people as smart as, Lois Lane and Lex Luthor would have figured it all out within a week, at most.
Yeah. No, I know. Like, I'm cool with the idea that people in Smallville would know, but it's just like a town secret.
Right.
But
I can buy that. But even, and like the way Smallville, the TV show handled it, this idea that people didn't really, it was this place where weird shit happened.
Right. Yeah.
Weird.
Curse,
sorry. Okay. Yeah. Where weird shit happened, and it was just one of those things. And this idea, like this urban legend, almost like the Loch Ness Monster, that that's fine. And also the way, you see it happens in a couple of these stories where a tornado kind of explains why he's flying because he's just kind of whipping around in the air, and also why Man of Steel kind of blew that point when, the idea, I don't want to get up. Anyway, moving right along.
There's not to get too far on this tangent, but there's a lot about the Snyder movies I'll defend. Mm-hmm. The tornado thing, that's tough. Mm-hmm. That's I can't muster an argument for that. No. But I just want to pick up a point that you made about, how Secret Origin pulled in things from the movies, but it kind of made you recognize, like, well, it's not as good as the movie.
Right.
I had a similar feeling reading Man of Steel, particularly the scene where Superman sits down with Lois.
Right.
And to me, on the page, he comes off as like kind of square, but I feel like in the movie there's that charm and that like little bit of slyness.
Yeah, he's playing with her a little bit.
Yeah,
yeah.
And it's just like a different dynamic, and it doesn't always.
It's also
translate.
the difference about seeing a great performance versus also reading it on the page. And as wonderful as comic books are, and the advantages comic books have in telling certain kinds of stories. Let's face it, having two terrific actors in roles that define them and they defined, play that kind of, you're not going to beat that. There's very little a comic can do to compete with what Margot Kidder and Christopher Reeve brought in that scene in particular, let alone a lot of what happened in that movie.
Right. And then we have the most recent one, Superman
Yes.
American Alien,
Right.
written by screenwriter Max Landis, who
Right.
did the film Chronicle and a number of other things. So it's 7 chapters, each one representing a different period in Clark's development. So, I mean, it hits a lot of the beats of the traditional origin story, but I don't think it's trying to be that necessarily. It's just trying to give you a glimpse into the formation of Clark's character at these various points along the way. And each chapter is illustrated by a different artist. So they really each have their own style and their own feel. This was pretty much all of them with the exception of Secret Origin, and I don't mean to dump on it, but pretty much all of these I enjoyed more on this reading, which was my second or third for all of these. And again, that's especially true for American Alien. I felt that it was the most relatable Clark that we've seen in any of these. Some could argue he's almost too relatable.
Well, my favorite is when he basically impersonates Bruce Wayne. That to me, I thought that was hysterical. I thought that was a really inventive idea and a really cool notion that, again, it's like it has, I mean, because that's one of the things that has always gone through. I mean, you kind of touched on it at the beginning, the whole idea of relatability. And people thinking of Superman, oh, he's too square, he's too this. No, he's actually not. And I think that is way too simplistic a viewpoint on the character, because when he's done well, he's a wonderfully written character, as we've seen in different media. But Superman has never it's been touched on, but I think American Alien did it best in bringing the Peter Parker quality. And by that, I mean the original, remember, everybody, the great power comes great responsibility. And the reason for that is that Peter's first instinct when he found out he had these powers is, I want to make money. I'm going to have revenge on all those, those jerks who were giving me a hard time in high school. I'm going to make a lot of money. I'm going to use this for personal gain and screw anybody else who gets in my way. And it's not quite the same thing here, obviously, but that's a natural impulse. And what I thought that Stan Lee and Steve Ditko answered beautifully, of course, in that story was, here's why that doesn't work. It addresses the idea that is a natural impulse for particularly a teenager to have that kind of selfish, kind of narcissistic, impulse. But then with Superman, it's his family who kind of draws him, kind of frames him. And in other cases, in Spider-Man's cases, most famously, he's, his Uncle Ben gets killed, and then he realizes with great power comes great responsibility. But that's one of the things that was my favorite parts of American Alien, is that it kind of addresses that issue with Clark, this idea that, hey, maybe I can go have a good time, and, I could be Bruce Wayne. And I thought that was really kind of neat. American Alien, the thing about American Alien that always, I wouldn't say confused me, is, again, I guess it kind of confused me, is that I enjoyed it. I enjoyed reading it. I liked it. I particularly liked the different artists who were on it, which we should probably name. It's Nick Dragotta, Tommy Lee Edwards, Joel Jones, Jay Lee, Francis Manipul, Jonathan Case, and Jock. I mean, these are prime comic book artists. Every one of them is a terrific artist. So, I mean, it's real A-list quality stuff here. Again, it's that, do we need another origin story? Is it necessary? I mean, and the other question, and it's not, again, really not that important, was it intended to be canonical? Because they never really said. It was kind of like left there that it might be, it might not be. Earth 1, those books where they said very clearly, this is not canonical, this is this other Earth. However, it's also another origin story. So every time you turn around with Superman, it's an origin story. So when I read it, I was like, oh, this is fine. I kind of like what it's bringing to it, some of his background and adding some of the darkness to the story. But at the same time, it was enjoyable, but I could have if it had never come out, I would have been perfectly fine with that too, because I've seen enough versions of the story.
Right. Yeah, I know right. I don't think we ever got a definitive answer. But I mean, to your point, I mean, maybe it, as you've argued with, like the three Jokers and all of that stuff, like, you make your own.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter. If you like the story, you like the story, and you can have it stand in for your favorite origin story or what have you. The other thing that we're not also talking about is the very brief redo of the origin that they did after, because the New 52, they kind of interwove with Morrison the idea of the Golden Age version, the social justice focused Superman wearing jeans and a t-shirt and all of that. And then kind of playing around with the origin there. And then when everybody really didn't respond well to that version of Superman, just a couple, last year, I guess it was, when they did Superman Reborn, they did another origin that basically said, okay, we're going to take the pre-52 and the post-52 and we're kind of merging them together. But there are still a lot of, there are still some holes in that origin story, but to me, I'm fine with it. It's because again, in my mind, it's Grant Morrison's one page is what's the most important.
True. And they're all imaginary stories.
Yeah,
after all.
Right.
But to your point, I mean, we're hitting really, the major tellings, but not all of them. So we're not discussing the Morrison New 52 stuff. So, and I'm sure there are other, other treatments of the origin, even if it was just like a single issue thing somewhere along the way. But, I feel like these have already and will continue to give us plenty to talk about. Just one thing I wanted to mention about American Alien, you talked about the issue where he impersonates Bruce Wayne and his good time. And along those lines, I mean, he hooks up with the woman on the yacht, and it's the kind of thing where reading it for the first time, you're taken aback by it because it's a departure from what's come before. But I liked it because it's like, who said this guy has to be a monk?
Right.
I mean, he's a young man. It's like
makes sense.
He should.
Well, this is the thing that this actually kind of goes to the heart of Superman and why I did. And again, not to dump on Man of Steel, but the understanding of what makes the character tick. And I've long been of the mind that for most people, if you are Superman, you probably figure out that you've hit the jackpot. I mean, to me, there's no reason if you're Superman for you to be, everybody has human emotions, and he is in a sense, he's a human being because that's the way he was raised and his makeup is. But I mean, you look like that. You can do all these wonderful things. You have a really strong moral compass. You have wonderful friends. You have a wonderful spouse, or at least a girlfriend, depending on which version of the story we're talking about.
Right.
I mean, you got to figure that if you looked like him and could do what he do, you'd think that he'd go off and be a 20-year-old and do the things that typical 20-year-olds do or whatever. And I found that eminently refreshing. That it was not just that he was a monk, that you're right, like he's much more relatable in that way, in a way that I didn't think hit you over the head with it. It was just telling you, it's like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Right,
sure, of course he would do that. Why
exactly.
not?
Like it just happens.
It didn't really harm anything.
Right. Like it's not antithetical to the core of the character. It's not undermining anything.
Exactly.
Because it makes me think of Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman.
Right.
He was a virgin in that show until he and Lois got married.
Like, come on.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Come on.
So that was refreshing. And along a similar line, the fact that he tells Pete and Kenny his secret in American Alien. Right. And it's the kind of thing where it's like, he probably would tell his buddies. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, I like that a lot. I thought
he would, because I mean, he told Lana in most of these tellings too when he was a teenager. So I mean, why wouldn't he tell his best friend?
Poor Lana. In almost all of these versions,
I know.
She thinks she's getting a ring.
I know. She gets the shaft every time, particularly in the Man of Steel. I mean, they make it like a tragedy that he told her that he could fly, and then he's like, I gotta go. And he's like, well, what about me? And like 10 years walking the earth, like, depressed. Yeah, Lana's kind of the thing that I think, I mean, we're getting really far afield here with this, but Lana doesn't really, she doesn't get a lot of, it's not the respect, but I don't think that people know what to do with her, because I'm not crazy with the whole idea of her being Superwoman and having these powers. And I also don't like the idea of her being this, this depressed, person and all of that. I mean, she should just be an old friend. I think that would be perfectly legit.
So old friend, not first love?
Oh, first love and old friend. I mean, first love who becomes an old friend, someone who, sure, they fell in love when they were in high school, but most people don't marry their high school sweethearts. And I think that that's also what's realistic about it, is that they both moved on, or, I mean, in Byrne's retelling, she didn't want to move on, but at the same time, I think you easily could credibly tell a story where they both moved on for, whatever reason. Maybe they just wanted different things in life. I think that would have been perfectly fine.
Right. I want to continue with the Smallville thread, but we'll come back to that because,
Right.
in terms of our thematic discussion, some of these origin stories begin with Krypton. So maybe we could start there. I mean, we've already, addressed this previously that, I think for both of us, it's a part we could probably do without in a lot of these tellings. But you said you liked the depiction of Krypton in Man of Steel. That was a very cold and sterile version of Krypton where, children aren't even created in the natural way.
There's no sex.
Right.
Yeah, I like it because it throws into sharp relief, and this is this is the big theme, and it was something that Byrne really set out to do and was important to him to do, because you're looking at the previous, I mean, if this is 1986, you're really looking at the previous 30 to 40 years, not the earliest part of Superman in the Golden Age, but later Golden Age, really the Mort Weisinger years, certainly all through the Silver Age and well into the Bronze Age. The idea that, and I was kind of touching on it before, that Krypton constantly shows up. And I'm not talking about, General Zod or Dev M or any of these other, but it was super horses and monkeys and super this and Kandor visits and this one and Superman gets to go back and Super Baby and all of that Krypton stuff that a lot of people really love left me cold. And it was part of the reason why I couldn't get into it. And it just didn't appeal to me. And so the idea that this focus on Superman as being an Earthling, although a Kryptonian by birth, is something that really does appeal to me. Also, and I know I hit this point a lot about Superman the movie, is that I thought that struck the perfect balance of, he is clearly of this planet, but he has a strong sense of his legacy. And Man of Steel basically emulates that. It opens up with this idea very similarly, doesn't, aesthetically it's not the same, but here is this, basically distant, cold world, scientifically focused, and it has a very specific way that its society is created, or at least what it's evolved into. And then you get him to Earth, and it changes the tone. It's like the difference. It's like the Wizard of Oz. The first 15 minutes being in black and white, and then boom, right, you have Technicolor. And I kind of see the same way. The idea of Krypton being this cold, whether it's icy or whether it's a green planet or however you want to do it aesthetically, but this idea that this is where he comes from, but what makes him who he is as a person, the idea of what his values are, comes from him being here, his parents, his Earth parents, his friends. And that is, to me, what makes him relatable. Not the Krypton stuff doesn't make him relatable to me. It's the Earth stuff that makes him relatable.
Right. Yeah. I definitely agree with that. And that's probably what I appreciate most about what Byrne did, was the emphasis on the man, right, over the super part.
Right.
So, that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting. So out of these 5, we only see Krypton in Man of Steel and Birthright.
Right.
We only spend time on Krypton.
Right.
But it's interesting in most of them, Clark's knowledge of where he comes from and when he finds out about where he comes from changes.
Yes.
in a lot of these. Yeah. Was there a particular sequence of events, I guess, that worked better for you than another?
No, I just the idea that his I always thought it made the most sense that his powers evolved as he grew. That he was always strong and he was invulnerable as a baby or as a child, but the different powers manifested themselves at different parts in his physical development, which of course was a big thing in Smallville.
Yeah, each season,
a huge thing, right?
Each season he got a new power,
right? But it made sense, and always using the joke that the heat vision is basically puberty.
Yeah, and we got to see that play out.
Right,
in
it plays
Secret
out in Secret Origin. You borrowed that idea that whenever he's gets excited, his eyes start to so it's used for comedic effect. So I like that idea. As far as when he finds out, he could be 18, he could be 15, he could be 12. I wouldn't care. It really doesn't matter to me. That was the one thing about Man of Steel, was that he doesn't really find out until he's an adult.
Yeah.
That he knows he's something. He might be Russian. He might be which makes, again, the Cold War elements that are there.
Exactly. Yeah, you see that at play big time. Yeah.
Right. Which really does fit the time. You know, it dates the story, but it doesn't. Well, maybe it doesn't anymore. But
well, I know everything.
Yeah, everything.
But I know it's funny. It's
Lex Luthor. I mean, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there was a Lex Luthor. Let's not forget who Lex Luthor was based on in John Byrne's version, but we'll get to that. Yeah. Megalomaniac, corporate titan who likes to put his name on everything. I don't know who he could be thinking of. But yeah, whether he found out, that to me was never that interesting. But I like the idea of him being 18, 19 years old. And that's what also helps to compel him to go and seek out his destiny. Like in the, Superman, the movie, the idea that that's kind of when he figures it all out.
Right. So here's one of the things that bugged me a little bit with the sequence in Man of Steel. So, he grows up thinking he's the natural son of Jonathan and Martha until Jonathan shows him the ship after the big football game. And so up until that point, Clark knows he has these abilities, but, doesn't know anything about them. And then he finds the ship and it's, I could be an alien or Russian. Right. And that's what kind of prompts him to say, okay, I need to do more with my powers. I didn't feel that the ship was really enough to account for why he would feel he had this other. I mean, I guess as I'm saying it, maybe it does make more sense, but I don't know. I felt like we needed a little bit more there. Like in For All Seasons, when the tornado hits, and he has this moment where it's like, what if I could have done more? And he goes to talk to the priest. He's like, if there's someone who could have saved everybody, who could have helped, wouldn't that person have that obligation to do that? I felt like that was more compelling than, I just won the football game, I'm riding high. Oh, wait, I came in this thing? Okay, I need to do something with my life.
It was that, and also him figuring out that he had these, he figures out he can fly was a lot to it. It was like, okay, wait, hold on. You're right. It is given short shrift. I mean, in the 6 issues, and he covers 10 years, there isn't, I agree with that and it was particularly noticeable when I reread it this time preparing for this podcast, was the fact that they don't really get into his motivation as far as that. It is kind of given short shrift, and he kind of, in the same way that it kind of like, okay, we're going to put an S on my chest too. And that kind of thing is also kind of just rushed together at the end of the first issue, because I think that they wanted to, the first issue in its own way covers more ground in terms of the Superman development than the rest of the other issues do, because it has to establish Krypton. It has to establish why he was sent. It has to establish him growing up in Smallville. It has to establish him coming to Metropolis without a costume. It has to establish why he would put on the costume. And I think they probably were very, very, very cognizant of the fact that at the end of the first issue, they wanted him in the costume. Yeah. So you have to get him from babyhood to costume in one issue, whereas the rest of the issues have a lot more room to breathe, because now he's here. So now we can introduce his relationship with Lois and Lex, and throw Jimmy into the mix, and the Daily Planet, and even Batman, which is, you're going to laugh, but to me, the one serious off note in the entire series, the one issue that didn't need to be told, they could have done it in 5 issues. If they had left out the whole Batman sequence, I would have been perfectly happy.
Oh, fascinating.
I never bought, even then when I read it, I never bought the way they introduced the characters. I never bought the way that their regard for each other. I never bought Magpie. Magpie? That's the villain that they were going to have be this big bad that Superman and Batman had to take down.
Yes, it was curious.
Magpie.
It was a curious choice.
Magpie, just for a little bit of history, post-Crisis, they did want to introduce some characters. Magpie was introduced in Batman right around this time. She was a brand new character, and clearly they were investing this idea that she was going to be something, because they introduced her in Batman. It was either they introduced her in Batman and introduced her in Man of Steel. Either it was roughly the same time. But to inject her into to me, it really dates the story, because otherwise it's timeless. But it's a terrible villain, and the way that they act, the whole thing just rings wrong to me.
Yeah. I mean, going back to the Krypton aspect of this, and when Clark finds out about his origins, in Man of Steel's defense, at least at that point, when they come up with the shield, he had already been named Superman in the newspaper. Sure. So at least we'll give them
that's
that.
The one thing all of them have to kind of answer for, because if he's as humble as he really is, he'd never want to be called Superman. He'd say, you can call me Cal, or you can call me something. Don't call me Superman. That's kind of silly. but it's, Superman is a corporate titan, corporate mascot, and he is Superman, and he's been around for 80 years, and that's his name. Right. So that's something that modern writers have always had to kind of struggle with, the idea of like, how do we get away with this guy actually being willing to call himself Superman and put a gigantic S on his chest besides.
So he doesn't find out about the Krypton of all of this until the final issue of Man of Steel, when he's sort of downloaded with everything, and comes to the conclusion that despite where he's from, it's Earth that made him who he is. And it's a nice moment to end on. Again, the sequence of it, for me, is not my favorite. Secret Origin's probably the most traditional version. The Kents show him the ship, the hologram pops up, and he finds out where he's from, and that he's the last of his race. And it does lead to... I do think one of the more emotional moments, and we got to see this in Man of Steel, and I thought it worked well in the movie as well, where Clark is upset and Jonathan goes to him, and Clark's like, can I keep pretending I'm your son? Right. And that moment of like, you are my son. Right. So I like that a lot. So that was again, more traditional depiction. Birthright was interesting because he has the ship and the knowledge that he comes from somewhere else, and he has all of the imagery, but can't really make sense of it. And it's Lex. Later on in the story, who helps him in the nastiest way possible.
Well, I don't mean it's not altruistically. I mean that it's Lex who translates for him essentially.
Right, and then Birthright also gives us this idea of the shield as a not just a symbol of the family, which we saw in the movie. But that
which was a great, I thought the most simplistic and really great way, an elegant way of handling it.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. But this took it a step further. The fact that it was like a flag for Krypton and symbolized hope, and the fact that he would design a costume like this because he was inspired by by what he had seen in all of these images. Sure. So one thing that I think was a neat twist was the end of Birthright, where through the wormhole or whatever that Lex creates, he's able to get a message to his parents as the planet is exploding. I thought that was a powerful moment. Anything else along the American Alien? That was actually something too, that as far as like touching moments, when Pete and Kenny come to visit Clark after he's already made his debut as Superman, and Pete's kind of giving Clark a hard time. Ultimately, we find out later in the issue, it's, he's worried about Clark. Sure. But it's coming off, maybe it seems like he's jealous or whatnot, and he asks Clark, why would you wear that symbol? And Clark says, it's like, so my parents might find me, because he's like, I've been on TV, like maybe those images get beamed up into space. It's like, if they see that, maybe they'll know where I am and they'll come for me. And similarly there, just as in Birthright, when Lex broke the news to Superman that Krypton was gone, in American Alien, we get Lobo delivering that news in the final issue that he's the last of his kind. And Clark starts to cry. Yeah. So again, American Alien in particular gave us a number of instances where Clark is scared, he's stuttering when he's talking to Lex. That reminds me of another moment. We're jumping off the Krypton thing for a moment, but two of my favorite moments, and Brian and I keep going back to Birthright, but two of my favorite moments in Birthright are when he's about to make his public debut in costume, and he whispers to himself, "Please don't let me look ridiculous." Yeah, right. Which I thought was a lot more effective than the Secret Origin moment when he comes down the stairs in the costume and he's like, "I'm never wearing this again."
No, it was like Ralphie in the pink bunny outfit in A Christmas Story. No, I thought that was great, this idea. And the way Gary Frank draws him, with his shoulders hunched, he's like, ah. And then later on, also before he puts on, when he makes his debut in Metropolis wearing the outfit, and he says to himself, if he's changing, he says, "Please don't make this too tight." He's like, but here we go. And I kind of like that. It's cute. Again, it's one of these things where the writers clearly feel that they need to address the inherent silliness of the Superman outfit in, as far as modern eyes are. It is kind of, superhero outfits are silly, but you kind of have to roll with it. And I don't mind if they have little jokey things about it. I just, it's better than, frankly, what they did in the New 52, which is put him in armor or you can have your little jokey, moments about the outfit, but leave the outfit alone. And the fact that DC has finally gone back and giving him, other than the little cuffs that they gave him as a nod to whatever they needed to do to make it different, leave it alone. Because, again, to go back to if one of Christopher Reeve's greatest achievements and gifts to comic book fans everywhere is that he didn't look ridiculous in the outfit.
Yeah.
And it's part of what sold that movie so well, as that if you can walk around Gene Hackman and Margot Kidder and basically 1970s New York City, the baddest, toughest city on the planet, and not look foolish, you've accomplished what you set out to do. And that's, and to me, I think comics should just simply take their cues from that.
Did you see the footage that from Henry Cavill's, I don't know if it was Screen Test or whatnot,
Yeah,
where it was
sure.
in
It was wearing
yeah.
the original. Yeah.
Yeah, and I thought it worked there too.
Of course it did.
Yeah. Again, just jumping to the movies for a second. I mean, for all of their shortcomings, I think he was and is a great Superman. I hope we get to see him take another turn at it. Now that he's been able to play some different colors of the character, I want to see more of that.
Colors being the operative word, but yeah,
in more ways than one.
More ways than one. Yeah, I think he's perfectly fine. I've never had a beef with him in the role at all. It's all about it's been about the approach to the character, but he's been fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he's got a sense of humor, and he's got a delivery. I like him.
The scene in Man of Steel when Lois asks him about the S, and he's like, "It's not an S." That little bit of, again, that's little slyness.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say about Birthright that just one of my favorite moments is, early on in the story when Clark is on his odyssey, he's traveling the world, he's reporting stories. And, one thing that he keeps running into is that he's, living and working among people, and then he sooner or later will use his powers and reveal himself, and they're scared.
Right.
And at that point, he's not in a costume. And part of the idea, I think, is that it's a bit of a betrayal that he's been among them.
Right.
And then all of a sudden he does these amazing things. So that's one of the reasons why he wants to have a costume. So it's like people see him coming. It's not, a trick or surprise or anything like that. And there's this
also why he doesn't wear a mask.
Right. Exactly. And so when he makes his debut and he saves Lois and she's, like telling him where to go next. And he has this moment where he's like, she's not afraid.
Right.
Love that.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah. And that's something I've also struggled with in terms of that's a thematic. I always thought that Byrne did it best with the idea that people would want a piece of him and would make demands of him and would want to touch him even, just because it would be people would see it as there would definitely be people who would see this as a religious experience.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, think about, if a man came down and could fly and do these wonderful things, cults would pop up. There would be people would be claiming that they were having religious experiences because of it. So I think that's inherently realistic. The idea that people would necessarily be afraid of him and the idea that to somehow darken Superman or put him into, I always thought that there was something really kind of cynical about that and something I didn't like. I always thought, you're trying to force this idea because of someone who looked like Superman, this handsome, friendly guy who by his actions alone has shown consistently that he is trying to help. I think people would buy that. However, as we have seen, particularly, and not to get too political, not to get, really into the nitty gritty of it, but particularly in reading some of these stories again for the first time in a while, I can't help but I couldn't escape what has gone on in our political discourse is what's going on now. And so, yes, a Lex Luthor would be able to manipulate public imagination and public thought, that people would necessarily turn on Superman if someone charismatic enough were somehow to point out that he were alien, that he is different, that he is not necessarily, that we cannot trust him, that even if what he says is straightforward and would on the face of it seem to be honest and honorable, you'd find a way to corrupt that. So I do now kind of see where that issue would need to be addressed. So my views on that have changed because the world has changed a lot in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I'm glad you addressed that because that was something I noticed too. Going from Man of Steel, where yes, they all want a piece of him,
right,
to Birthright and Secret Origin, where he has to win the people over, where they're distrustful of him.
Which I never bought until I started reading him again, like I said.
Yeah. No, I mean, I understand. As far as, so we talked about the Krypton aspect and, when and how he finds out about where he's from. As far as Smallville goes, and, well, I guess there are a number of components to this. The depiction of the Kents, they get younger and younger and more vibrant.
And sometimes they live, sometimes they die.
Okay, I'm glad you brought this up. So, your definitive version.
Right.
Does Jonathan in particular? Does Jonathan live?
Yeah.
Or does
Because what is the value in having him die from a storytelling standpoint?
Exactly.
Why kill him?
There's only one instance, and I think I wrote about it in the article. One instance where I get it, and it's probably the most compelling argument that I can come up with. It's in Superman the movie,
Yes.
when he's standing at the grave with Martha, and I get choked up when every time I watch it, and I got to watch it on the big screen for the first time in my life when Alamo screened it,
Right.
and it was great. I mean, I've seen it so many
Did
times.
I see you there?
No, I don't think
Because I was there that night.
I can't
was
remember.
wearing this shirt. In
No,
fact.
maybe I did actually. But it was such a cool experience, and I've done that now with It's a Wonderful Life and the Rocky movies, and it's one thing to watch them on your own, but you go and you see them on a big screen.
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's cool
It's
too,
wonderful.
because it's like you watch it on your own, and certain things make you laugh or whatever, and then to watch it with other people, and it's like, oh, like you have a similar shared experience like that. So that was really cool. But I always get choked up when he's at Jonathan's grave, and he's like, all these powers, like all these things I can do, and I couldn't save him.
Right.
So if it serves the purpose of illustrating to Clark the limits, and the fact that he's still always going to try, even though he'll never be able to save everyone, I'm kind of okay with it, but I much, much, much prefer the version where the Kens are there. They're still a part of his life. They represent Smallville. He goes there and he can seek their counsel, especially early in his journey when Lois is not in on the secret yet, and he doesn't have people that he can really confide in.
Right.
I feel like there's a lot that we can learn about what he's thinking and things like that. So for me, and part of this, I'm sure a big part, is informed by the fact that that's the version I grew up reading. So during the comics in the 90s and Lois and Clark, it's like the parents were there. So that's the version that I prefer as well.
I prefer it for another reason, which is death is a part of life, and every one of us it's what we all share in common. We are all going to die, and we all know people who are going to die. You can't escape that. And people are going to say, well, it's real life and you want them to, deal with real life issues. Yes, of course. But what I liked about the idea of him not losing his parents is that every other superhero in the universe lost their parents.
Yes.
They're all orphans, or they're all damaged, or they all had these traumatic experiences that drive them. What part of what makes Superman so appealing to me, and I say this as a Batman fan who's, obviously the opposite, is I like the fact that he's an adult who has parents who are still alive, that he can call them up and ask for advice, or just to talk or chat about the ball game, or hang out with mom and whatever mom's doing. And I just like that about him because it makes him unique in that respect. I mean, that's one of the things, particularly when they've redone a lot of the origins over the last 10 or 20 years, they've added these elements of tragedy. They've added these elements of dead parents, the Flash, Green Lantern.
Yeah, when you were saying that, that's immediately what I went to.
Which didn't
Jeph
used
Johns.
to be there. They did not used to be there. And to make that a almost like a prerequisite of the superhero life, I figured, now let Superman's parents be. Let him be, because it doesn't really change anything. And the idea of his limitations, and I agree with you, it's really effectively done in the movie. And it does help to drive him, it helps drive him to make the decision he makes at the end of the movie about whether to interfere with what happens with Lois. So from a storytelling standpoint, there's a payoff there. But thematically, it also shows him, it does show that Superman does have his limits, even though then he exceeds those limits. But those limits can be shown in other ways. You don't have to do it through his parents.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I really could do without seeing another depiction where Jonathan's clutching his heart and he goes down.
And then have Superman
guy
sitting on the floor weeping. It's like, I know, I mean, look, I appreciate those scenes where Superman does become overwhelmed with emotion, because again, it humanizes him and all of that. But again, every time I saw it, even was the end of Superman and Brainiac, the way with Jeph Johns, it was the same thing. I kind of felt like my shoulder sagged when I read it, and not because I was moved by the story. It was like, really? Come on. Do we have to do this again?
Yeah. And not to knock Johns, because again, I
because
really have been a fan.
loved it. I loved his run. It
Yeah.
wasn't perfect, but I really loved. I also felt like what frustrated me about Johns' run is it never really finished. He kind of stopped in the middle, because then they handed it off to the new Krypton stuff and whatever. But what he did do, I really, really enjoyed.
Yeah. No, I agree. I actually recently revisited the Last Son arc and Brainiac, and those two in particular.
My favorite, actually, in that one, ironically enough, is the Legion. What he did.
The Legion.
I really loved the Legion arc that he did. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I said I didn't like Clark's time as a youngster with the Legion, but I did enjoy that story that you just referenced.
He was an adult,
exactly,
which I thought was perfect. I thought that was a great way of handling it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I mean, on the note of the Legion, I mean, I love the idea that this is a group that's been inspired by his legacy.
Which
perfect.
is great. Right.
I liked what they did on the Smallville TV show, where Legion comes to him.
Right.
That's fine. I'll take that too.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm trying to remember where I was going to go next with this. On the note of the Kents.
Right.
So Yeah, so in Man of Steel and For All Seasons, they're quite elderly. Right. By the time we get to Birthright, they're a lot younger. I love
all TVs and movies. They're matching the TVs in the movies.
Yeah, exactly. So by the time Birthright came around, we had Smallville, the TV show, where you had John Schneider and Ned O'Toole, and they were part of the action. I always remember the season 4 finale when they battle Jason Teague, the character played by Jensen Ackles, and like they're brawling in the Kent house, like they're really going at it. Like, I loved it. It was great. One of the twists on this that I really liked in Birthright was the idea that Martha would be like this UFO expert.
Right.
And I think in the back, Waid has his notes about it, and he talked about how, if you have a child with a developmental disability, for example, like you become an expert on that. You do all this research. So it made sense that Martha would, would kind of go that route. Another thing that was a little bit different here, certainly a difference from Birthright and Secret Origin as well, where, in those instances, in Man of Steel, Jonathan has the idea, right, to don the costume. In Secret Origin, Martha's like, your clothes keep getting torn, so I'm going to create this. And the parents are very much on board with it. In Birthright, Clark comes to them with this idea of like, this is something that I need to do. And Jonathan really wrestles with that. I thought that was, again, going back to relatability, sort of having that sort of divide with the parent and finding common ground again. I thought that was very relatable. Sure. And when Clark has that moment where he talks to Jonathan about everything that Jonathan did, like going out on his own into the world, and that he wasn't, following in his footsteps in that way. I thought that worked very well.
It's just endearing to see an adult. I mean, and maybe it's also, for me, it's particularly poignant because my son is pretty much an adult now. He's a college student, and we have conversations now that we could not have had 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly. So to see the idea that Superman would have someone to go to, someone to seek their counsel for certain things that you might not be able to talk to anybody else about, I think that's really moving, and I think it's really poignant, and I think it's something that it's nice if it can be preserved. Yeah. Even if he's happily married, and because there are things that you might want to talk to a parent about that you wouldn't necessarily, or obviously in the ideal marriage you can talk to your spouse about anything, but still having your father, your mother there to give you a different viewpoint is healthy and helpful. If you have the kind of relationship that Superman has with his parents.
Right. So shifting, I guess, to the Metropolis side of it.
This is my favorite. Yes.
One thing that I particularly wanted to ask you about, as a journalist yourself.
Yes.
How do you feel about, in Man of Steel in particular, in the second issue of Clark beating Lois to the Superman story, basically writing about himself?
It's unethical completely, but it's funny. I mean, that's all. It's really unethical. It's not something, but he's got to pay the rent. At the same time, the dude's it's certainly not something he should do. It's really not, but then again, we don't have flying people with dual identities as far as we know anyway, running around. So I'll give him a pass on that. It works for the humor of it. It is also, that's Byrne's way of telling you that this is a different Clark Kent than what we have seen before. And it kind of goes to that idea of what you were talking about, the more assertive version of Clark Kent as opposed to the bumbling version. And I agree with you. I actually do prefer that Clark Kent to the bumbling Clark Kent. I think that the bumbling Clark Kent, I mean, Christopher Reeve did it with such charm,
right,
that I'm cool with it, because it was sly, and because the way he would look under his glasses or whatever, or his cold moments where not him being cold, but the cold comment when she says to him, anyone more like you at home? He goes, no, not really. That deadpan the way you're it's still, and you talk about something that we saw in the movie theater. Everybody broke up at that. You know it's coming. You've heard it 1,000 times, but it's great. So that's one place where it works. I think in Secret Origin, it definitely felt overcooked, and frankly, I think in For All Seasons too, they kind of make him kind of a bumpkin For All Seasons, which I never really, I could understand the loneliness and I could understand him being unsure of himself, but they also kind of made him a bit of a rube, which I there's a fine line between making him mild-mannered and being a little innocent. And I think that what I liked about what Byrne did, and I remembered at the time he talked about it, is that he wanted to make him more like the George Reeves Clark Kent. Because when you watch those old shows, that Clark Kent carries the show. I mean, he really is. I mean, for the half hour, 20 minutes it's Clark Kent, and the last 10 minutes is Superman. And so you can't watch him bumbling around for 20 minutes. He's the intrepid reporter. He's really the leader of the planet's reporting crew. You know, you've got Lois and Jimmy kind of as his wing people. And it's done in a way that you do kind of forget that they're the same guy. And I think the idea that Byrne made him more confident, more, you know, aware of his appearance, but was able to disguise him in a way by doing his hair, wearing his glasses, maybe slouching a little bit. If that whole notion of if you weren't looking for it, then you wouldn't see it.
Yes.
And that's something that I still think that Lois would have figured out on day one.
Right.
And I always thought that there have been some really great riffs on that over the years. But if you're assuming that, because unless he tells you, why would you necessarily assume that Superman is sitting 2 cubicles over?
Right.
You wouldn't really think of it. You might think, Jesus, that guy looks like Superman. Do you ever say, anybody say you look like, I mean, that to me would be the best way to handle it. Anybody ever say you look like Superman? Yeah, I get that a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it, right.
We literally got that in American Alien,
right,
where
right.
Pete says to him, like, what do you just wear your glasses all the time? And Clark's like, a lot of times I don't. And you know what people say? You look a lot like Superman.
Right, exactly. Because people wouldn't, wouldn't think of it. You'd just say, you know, I mean, I don't know how many, I'm sure people in your life have said, you know who you look like? You look like so-and-so. Yeah, I get that a lot.
I've gotten, before I had my LASIK, and I had, I normally would wear contacts, but every now and then I would be lazy and just throw my glasses on. Right. And at work, there were a couple of times where like people were like, oh, I didn't recognize you at first. Right. So I've never had that hard a time suspending my disbelief when it comes to that, especially when you factor in all of these other things that are addressed where, the glasses, hide the blue in his eyes, right? Or the fact that he changes his posture and his voice. Birthright talks about, studying acting, like he has acting books.
Right.
So all of that stuff always made sense to me. And I never had a hard time buying that the person walking by, wouldn't make the connection. And I feel like these days, more than ever, it's believable because everyone's just buried in their phone.
Yes.
So it's like, and again, you're not thinking about it. It's not like he said, like he's, as Superman is like, maybe I'll pass you on the street one day and then everyone's looking.
Right.
But I agree 100%. The part that's really, really a stretch, I feel like anyone who interacts with both Clark and Superman on a regular basis would have to put it together. Right. And to me, that's Lois and that's Jimmy and that's Perry. Though Perry, I've always believed knows. Like he knows. He's just cool about it.
Does Gordon know that Batman is Bruce Wayne? Yeah.
That's my feeling with both of those guys. It's like they know and they're just cool about it. Yeah. That's always been my feeling. But
the only one that I think it really stretches it would be Lois.
Yeah.
That would be the one where it's like she has to know. She's too smart.
Right.
Day one, she's got to say, hold on a second, mister. And it would actually make, you're throwing out, decades of comic book history and concepts and all of that to do it. And I understand that, but that's actually why I like them married. I like the idea that they are married and like the fact that they brought that back into the comic books and the fact that they have a son, because I like the idea that she's his ally and she helps to protect his identity. Yeah. And I like that. That to me, that's much more interesting than is she going to find out? And she's thinking, and then the inevitable, oh, Lois, that's the stupidest thing you ever thought of.
And we see that play out in a number of these.
Yes.
Going back to the Man of Steel movie, that's one of the things that I like, that we didn't really have to waste time with that. She's, knows from the beginning. So as far as, the depiction of Clark, again, I mean, I would take the assertive Clark over the bumbling one, but still my favorite is, once again, Birthright, because I feel like that splits the difference, where he's just more unassuming. And there's a great moment where he's interviewing with Perry and, he's doing his shtick, and then Perry's like, speak up, son. And he does so, and then he realizes...
got bags of humility.
Yeah, and then he realizes he needs to dial it back, and he has that moment, and he knocks over the pens. And I feel like it's that moment of I have to do this. Yeah. So that's what I liked. And I know we've moved on to the Metropolis portion, but just jumping back to Smallville for a moment, the depiction of Clark in Smallville changes over the course of these tellings as well, where he's the football star in Man of Steel.
Which, to me, and again, I actually think that Byrne, it's handled in different ways, but there are some, thematically, there's some similarities between the stories. But what I like in the way Byrne is that it kind of makes sense. In the same way that, and they address this in the TV show Smallville too, which I thought was, if you look like Tom Welling, if you are built like him, I don't want to put too fine a point on it because I know we're not supposed to, think in these terms, but frankly, as a society, we do. if you are built like him and look like him and can do the things that he can do and doesn't know the full extent of his ability, doesn't know he can fly, he doesn't have heat vision, he does all this kind of stuff. At least I don't think he does at that point in Man of Steel.
Right.
He would do that. That's kind of a natural thing for him to do. I'm really good at sports. I can do this. Then when he kind of overdoes it, that's when his father tells him, you know what? Don't get so, don't fall in love with yourself there, pal.
Right.
I mean, that's a role of a father to do, is that he pulls his son back in and says, hold on a second, you need to learn some humility here. And I like that about him. I thought that it was a natural thing to think of Clark Kent if he wasn't Superboy, if he wasn't fully aware of his powers, but knew he was something special. He might go out for the football team and do really well, and his father might not necessarily be happy with the way it turned out. So using that as an instructive way to point out his need to be humble and his need to rein it in, I thought that was an effective way of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100%. And, going back to Smallville, the TV show, and these lessons of humility, one of my favorite moments from the pilot is after Clark has rescued Lex when they go off the bridge. Lex gifts Clark a new truck.
Right.
And Clark's very happy about this. And Jonathan reins him in, and he's like, you can't accept this. And Clark's like, well, why not? Like, I saved his life. And Jonathan's like, well, you think you deserve a prize?
Right. Right, you're right.
Yeah.
You're not doing this for fame, fortune, and prizes. You're doing this because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. So I have to say, as far as the depictions of Clark in Smallville, in that case, I think Man of Steel probably is my favorite. I think that makes sense. Going back to your other point, I'm so glad you brought this up about Clark as like a bumpkin in For All Seasons. Maybe we got that because, unless I'm forgetting, For All Seasons doesn't address the global odyssey that Clark often takes in his journey.
No, it doesn't. Not to my recollection. I just reread it again the other day, but I don't remember that.
And I think that really is an important part in his journey for a number of reasons.
Which Birthright really hammers.
Birthright gets into that. The Man of Steel movie too. The fact that he's out there in the world, and like I said, I feel like what often gets shortchanged is that decision to put on the costume and become this other person. And again, I feel like Birthright addresses that. And we see that especially through that odyssey and through these encounters that he has. And maybe through that odyssey, he sheds that what could be like a bumpkin, right. Persona. And For All Seasons kind of skips over that. Mm-hmm. So, but I mean, that makes sense. As far as Lex, so we've talked about Lex a couple of times. Mm-hmm. So, well, I'll let you take it first. What do you want to say about Lex?
I think that, and this was also part of the reason I think I also had a difficult time getting into Superman was because he was able to do everything. I had a hard time believing, other than the three villains of Krypton, that there was any real way that a villain could really be a challenge for him. I think Parasite is a great Superman villain. Actually, I think that's what Secret Origin does really well, is that it picks the villains who really could challenge Superman. Parasite, Metallo, Lex Luthor. I mean, the ones who really, not Toyman, not the prankster, and it avoids the three Kryptonian villains completely, which is a wise thing to do. And of course, it had also been handled in a different part of Geoff Johns' run, the first part, which was terrific, actually. But anyway, what I did like about the first Lex Luthor I liked wasn't, Super Friends Lex Luthor, who wore his outfit and
right.
the little, with the rocket packs and all of that. I mean, it kind of looks cool. I get it, but it was never, it never seemed to be a fair matchup. So I liked the movie version of Lex Luthor. This idea of him, basically being an evil real estate developer.
Oh, these real estate
schemes. These real estate developers, yeah. But I love the way it's handled. That it's mind over muscle. Right. And the battle of wits, and that to me is what made that such a compelling way, and the fact that he thought big, the idea of like destroying the West Coast, and his scheme was what was the challenge for Superman, not his physicality. Man of Steel takes that further, and what I liked about it again is that it was this idea that he is this guy who isn't running around in battle armor or with rocket packs, but it's his political influence, it's who he is, it's what, and this was by design. They wanted to make, and I remember, it's unfortunate, a lot of that stuff, a lot of the interviews that were available at the time are not easily accessible now. or at least you have to know where to look for them because they're not on the web. But there were a lot of interviews at the time where Byrne was talking about what he wanted to do and why he did certain things. And he I remember at the time reading that he wanted Lex Luthor to basically be a Donald Trump, that he was this idea that he was this corporate titan. He put his name on every building, everything he did. His ego is what drove him. And plus, you're dealing with a time at the height of the corporate 80s also. This was very much a big, part of the culture at the time. And I mean, it is now again, of course, but this was, it was one of those high points, as far as the way, our culture was, particularly in New York, which is what, Metropolis is one of the analogs for New York. So this idea that Lex is this, he basically owns the city, quote unquote, the idea that he's vain, the whole bit with his hair and all of that, the idea that he didn't lose his hair in a chemical accident. He didn't blame Superman for that. No, he was humiliated by Lois, and so he basically decides that he's going to shave his head, which to me is the only appropriate reason for Lex Luthor to be bald. It is simply that he's vain. But I think that, particularly in rereading The Man of Steel, is that the idea that they would, and it helps. Again, it kind of goes back to what I was saying before about people being suspicious. I don't buy the idea that Lex Luthor's motivation against Superman is because he doesn't like aliens per se.
Agreed.
I don't think that the idea that he doesn't, I don't think an alien should, I'm pro-human and all. I don't buy that to me, Lex Luthor is an opportunist. Lex Luthor might use that idea against Superman and try to get the public against him and sow suspicion and discontent and use it as a weapon, but it's not necessarily something he would believe. I much prefer him being a charlatan. I much prefer him being this manipulative, behind the scenes, one step ahead, you're never going to catch me, even if you know what I'm up to kind of villain. I find that so much more compelling than a guy who puts on a battle suit and tries to punch out Superman or I find that the Machiavellian nature of that character is far more compelling than anything else. And it's something that it's harder for Superman to get his arms around. And I like the fact that Superman the Animated Series really embraced that idea. Mm-hmm. And I much prefer, I also prefer the idea that he never met Lex until he got to Metropolis. That Lex, to me, even though I enjoyed Michael Rosenbaum a lot and I really liked Smallville, my preference is simply when he goes to Metropolis, he encounters this guy, this all-powerful Lex Luthor. And Lex doesn't like Superman simply because Superman humiliates him. And as we have seen, when people with that thin-skinned and people who have, who are easily humiliated, vengeance on those grounds alone is enough to turn them against you. And I think that that's all that we needed with Lex Luthor. And to this day, I still think that's the best version of Lex Luthor.
Well said. I mean, I agree with pretty much everything. The one place where I would diverge, and probably not a surprise, is the relationship in Smallville. And that being said, I don't really love the treatment in Birthright or Secret Origin, right. Both of Neither which insert Lex into Smallville. Right. Secret Origin in particular felt really perfunctory. To me, really just felt like, okay, it's to show that like they had this prior encounter, right. And I didn't feel that it really added much. No. Birthright at least went deeper with that. And I'm assuming, again, this Birthright was, right around the time that, Smallville was getting going. Right. So, I mean, I'm sure that was an influence.
And Secret Origin 2 was when Smallville was still on.
Yeah.
And so it's definitely, I mean, his father's name is Leinil Luthor, and but go ahead.
But that being said, and maybe this is just, again, the times in our lives when we were exposed to these things, mm-hmm. and the connections that we make, Smallville was a big thing for me, and it's still mm-hmm. my favorite show and, sure. and, my favorite version of a lot of these characters. But I like the version of Lex in Smallville where he's, at the beginning of the show, he's like the nicest guy in town. Mm-hmm. He's not this freak, really, which is the way he's depicted in these stories. And, the bond that he and Clark have in the show, I mean, it's a genuine friendship.
Right.
And, Birthright, kind of got at that, but still it was very tentative. So I guess I kind of felt with both of them, it was kind of like, they were, inserting Lex, so I guess to reflect what was, what a lot of people were familiar with at the time due to the show, but it really didn't give us the depth that we were getting on screen. So it was the kind of thing where I don't know that I probably would have preferred if they had just left it that they meet in Metropolis.
I think the reason it worked on TV is because you had full seasons to develop the characters and develop their relationship and make it believable. You also, because of the way they started the show, they didn't have an end game in mind, really. Remember, that show went on for 10 years and really should have been 5.
Yeah.
No, I mean,
I know.
No, I mean, that to me, I think actually Smallville would have been a perfect show if it had been 5 13-episode seasons. I think that you would have had what it would have been it gave rise to the rest of the CW shows, and it really did, it was groundbreaking, excuse me, in that regard. But even when I was watching those early episodes, I thought to myself, how are they going to justify the fact that Lex and Clark are such good friends and he sees him all the time with his face and doesn't, when they get to Metropolis someday, how is he not going to know? And I guess they're going to give him a bump on the head and whatever. And we know how they ended up resolving it on Smallville. But to me, that's always been the part that they have never really been able to deal with, because since they kind of always seem to be shoehorning it in, other than what they did back in the 60s and the way they had the Superboy stories back then, which again, I thought were always implausible. Here, it is shoehorned because they never really explain why someone with his brilliance wouldn't recognize Clark, wouldn't make the connection, wouldn't put 2 and 2 together. He's one of the smartest men in the world. They kind of pay lip service, the idea that he doesn't want to remember Smallville, so he doesn't remember Smallville, or if he remembers it, he's not saying. And to me, you're asking to make too many excuses for it. So I think it's just so much smoother, and they don't ever explain it in the comics. In the modern comics, they haven't explained why it would be necessary that he was in Smallville, other than to adhere to what some people know because of the TV show or maybe some other versions. To me, it's very simple. He gets to Metropolis. There's this big bad corporate overlord who who's running things and is really shady, but has never been caught. He offends Superman's sensibilities, and Lex is jealous of Superman's appeal. And to me, that's enough. We're seeing it in, again, not to get too political, but we're seeing that writ large in our society right now. It just shows that kind of motivation can be very, very powerful. And I thought that Byrne was onto something. And the writers who followed him, I think the ones who stuck with it, I thought really were smart.
See, I feel like there can be tremendous value in them having a deep friendship in Smallville. And that was one of the things that I always felt the show did well. I mean, as much as I loved it, there were always things that were frustrating to me about watching it. But the Clark-Lex dynamic and Lex's journey in particular, I felt they really handled that well. And
that's also because they had the time to do it. Yeah.
But I was never too worried about he won't. How could he not recognize him later? Because I figured, well, no, he would recognize him. Right. He would know. But again, going back to your point about how he's this Machiavellian mastermind, he would know, but it would be power over Clark.
That if they ever got to tell that story, then I could see that, but they never really have.
No, and that's what. And again, I can, and at some point we'll do a whole Smallville podcast. But that was one of the things that broke my heart about the series finale when all of Lex's memories are erased, which is problematic in a number of ways. It's like he has this great journey, and then literally everything is gone.
And you're right about his journey is as important as Clark's is on that show. I mean, it was, Michael Rosenbaum wanted to leave. We know that all of the behind the scenes stuff that was going on, but you're right about the fact that on that show that Lex's story is, if Clark is obviously 1A, Lex is 1B, and he is, and Rosenbaum was terrific in the role, and it's a compelling story, but it's because they had that much room to tell the story. I think in comics, because there is no Superman in Smallville comic book, there is no Superboy comic book anymore, and there isn't going to be anytime soon. Throwing it in there now, to me, sticks out like a sore thumb.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, again, unless it can be done the way it's done on the show, which for the reasons we discussed is really not feasible, I don't know how much they gain by just throwing in these Smallville encounters. The last thing I'll say about Smallville, one of my favorite moments in the series finale before Lex's memories are erased, the last thing Clark says to Lex before he speeds off to go take on Darkseid is, "I'm sorry I couldn't save you."
Right.
And, as you're watching the show, there's always this question of well, maybe would Lex have taken a different path if Clark just confided in him and didn't lie to him all the time? So it's an interesting thing. So again, I do think there can be value if I agree with your point, if it has the room to breathe. So So as far as other themes, anything that you particularly wanted to get at?
No, I think that I was thinking about if there's anything to say about his relationship with Lois, but that's fairly consistent throughout. I mean, there aren't any major changes in her background. You know, they more firmly established, particularly with Byrne, because remember, Lois had historically been shown, and I can't speak to what the last 10 years before Crisis was like, because I really haven't read a lot of that stuff.
Okay.
But she was always a good reporter, but they really established with, and I think the movie helped with this, is that it's not that she's a really good reporter, she's the best reporter. You know, she's the best at what she does. So I kind of like the way that Byrne handled the idea that they're actually kind of rivals, you know, in the newsroom, and that they're always kind of playing, you know, can you top this? I like that. I don't think it's necessary for their relationship. But you know, and throughout all of this, it's nice to see Jimmy show up, but you know, it's funny because Jimmy I think Bendis is going to do a lot more with Jimmy, it feels like, than what a lot of writers have done in recent years. Jimmy hasn't really been much, but he doesn't really factor in. He actually, I think, factors more into Secret Origin than he does in any of these.
Yes.
He's and I like that. And I've never been a big Jimmy Olsen fan. But when he's done well, he's charming, and he's charming in Secret Origin. But the thing is that I when it comes down to it, my preference is still the Man of Steel. But as far as the other stories that go, they're all still very, very good stories, and it's down to the fact that you're dealing with a great character. Whether you're dealing with him in Metropolis or whether you're dealing with him in Smallville, there's a reason that this character endures.
Yeah, no, well said. I mean, just a couple follow-up things. Yeah, I agree with your point about Jimmy, and that was a nice touch in Secret Origin that, you know, he's ready to throw in the towel and
right.
back to Yonkers.
Yonkers, yes, he's going to go back to Yonkers.
He's going to come back to Yonkers,
yeah.
And you know, Superman poses for him, and he's the only one that you know, that'll pose.
And with the
for
hands
him.
on the hips,
the hands on
which
the
is
hips,
great.
You know, so that was nice. As far as Lois, I agree, it is pretty consistent throughout. Where we get the most actually is American Alien, where Clark and Lois actually embark upon a relationship, and at the very end, after Clark's in the hospital after getting beaten by Lobo, you know, she shows up. He had previously said "I love you," and she ran out, and so, you know, she reciprocates, and it's a nice moment to end on. I mean, I guess maybe, you know, as far as, you know, how much ground these other origin stories are covering, there's just, you know, it stops before we would really get
right. But I also did like the way Secret Origin showed that she would become interested in the bumbling Clark, because that's often been the issue. You know, there's always been the triangles that Clark likes Lois likes Superman, and you know, and the dance went on for decades. Toward the end of Secret Origin, when he stands up, you know, stares down John Corbin, and she, you know, Metallo, and she's really impressed by that, and she starts to see him in a different light. And then, of course, he intentionally spills milk on her, and she's like, what were you thinking? But it gives that early rise to the idea that she would value Clark beyond, you know, hey, Smallville, and kind of being her, you know, her crash test dummy or her rival or whatever. It shows that they could actually become friends without him, you know, wearing the cape, which I like.
Right. Oh, kind of, you know, speaking about Lois, we talked about Jimmy. As far as Clark as the reporter and the Daily Planet in this, I think we see an evolution in the way the Daily Planet is depicted, and I think that's very reflective of the times.
Yes.
Right? So by the time we get to Birthright, you know, the Daily Planet has their webpage, and the webpage needs to be refreshed. Perry wants the page refreshed.
But I think, wasn't it like after it, like they refresh it the next day?
It was
something like, again, I'm like, well, no, it doesn't work that way. But when it was written, that you weren't thinking like instantaneous. I mean, the web was still, I mean, and frankly, you know, as far as journalism, it took an entire industry to kind of figure out, well, how is the web supposed to work for us? Yeah. And what are we supposed to do? You know, we're not supposed to put it up when it happens, because then people won't buy the next day's paper, which was an eternal struggle. And to some degrees, there are still vestiges in that in journalism. But as a journalist, it's also interesting to see how it's portrayed and how much of that is realistic and how much of that is not realistic. And the fact that the idea that they, you know, I think it's Secret Origin where, you know, it's basically failing.
Yeah,
you know,
that's what I was going to get to.
It's a dying enterprise, as opposed to 1986 where it's still very much the Daily Planet.
It's like the planet doesn't spin. It's rusted. There's graffiti on the wall outside.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, it's interesting. And again, yes, always reflective of the times. By the time we get to American Alien, like Clark and Lois, they're students, they've won an internship at the planet.
But keep in mind also that was something that DC was dealing with back in the 70s too, because their first attempt to quote unquote modernize Superman, where that was the intent, was make them TV people.
Right.
Forget the planet and put them on WGBS. And so for most of the 70s and into the 80s, the planet was secondary to all of that. And that added a whole element. Although, again, that was one of those things where, the Anchorman looks an awful lot like Superman. So millions of people get to see him up close in their TV, and nobody notices that the guy is sitting there with the picture of Superman behind him, and they're not the same guy.
So full disclosure, I haven't read any of Bendis's Man of Steel yet. They're all waiting for me at All Yeah Comics, but I haven't picked them up yet, but I will. And obviously we'll be talking about that next time.
Yes.
But one of the things that I know Bendis has talked about in interviews is really playing up the reporter angle with Clark. And one thing that he said repeatedly in interviews is, Clark didn't choose to be born on Krypton and to have these powers, but he chose to become a reporter.
Right.
And that's something that I agree with, and I hope to see that explored more fully. I never really liked the idea that he's just a reporter because that he'll hear about things first. I mean, I like the idea that it's something he's actually passionate about.
But that made sense in 1938.
True,
because that was how you did hear things first. You had
Right.
the police radio. You're in the newsroom. It wasn't. He didn't have a phone, in his pocket. He didn't have the web. He didn't. Now. He doesn't need to be a reporter. And I was thinking about this also. Clark Kent today would not need to be a reporter. In fact, it would probably be a pretty bad idea for him to be a reporter. It would be a pretty good job for him, would be something that he could do that it would pay the rent, but he would be able to very quickly duck out if he had to, because frankly, if anything is happening in the world that would need a Superman, natural disasters, gigantic robots landing in Metropolis Central Park, he doesn't need to be in a newsroom. Now this, I am not knocking my own profession here. I am not trying to find a way not to be employed. But when you're Superman specifically, we as journalists, we find things out first, but our whole jobs is to get it out there as quickly as humanly possible, which is minutes. So if you're Superman, if you're actually doing the job, you can't leave the job. You have to stay doing exactly. You'll get fired really quick if every time some natural disaster happens and your editor is waiting for you to file that story, and you run and all of a sudden you disappear. You're gone, man. HR is going to march you out. Forget it. So in a way, it makes more sense for him to have a job where he would be able to disappear a little bit more discreetly, but keep abreast of what's going on in the world around him. So the idea of Bendis giving him a reason that makes sense today, in today's world, that he wants to do that because he wants to do good in his other life. You do have to think, does Superman need a job? Okay. He doesn't need to eat. He can sleep in the Fortress of Solitude. He does because I would prefer the idea that, he needs human interaction.
Yeah.
He needs friends.
Right.
He needs things to do. And he also needs a place where he can decompress. And that's one of the things that some of these stories have done very, very well, which we really haven't touched on, is why can't he be Superman 24/7? Even if his physical abilities would allow him to do it, his emotional abilities would not. And it's not we're not talking about mental acuity. We're talking about emotions. And that's what makes Superman Superman, is he can't be all things to all people at all times. He needs to rest, or he will go mad. Because emotionally and mentally, he's a human being. Because think about that. Even if you didn't physically need to rest, you would need to rest your mind. You would need a chance to break away. So if you do want that human interaction, if you want to have the closest thing that you can approximate to a real life, a real human life, then choosing journalism does make sense, because you do have the opportunity to do good work on a very, very basic level. So the idea that he's going to address that and make that a part of his world, I think, is terrific. I've read the first couple of issues of Man of Steel. I'm 2 issues behind. Issue number 4 just came out as we're recording this. So far they haven't really gotten into that much, but I know that they will. So.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the fact that he's raised as a human. So the idea that he would that he would move forward and he would get a job and all that stuff makes a lot of sense. Yeah. One other thing that I just wanted to mention is not connected to anything you just said, but one of the things that I really actually did like about Secret Origin was this this bit about Lex going out to the masses every day and picking someone to help.
Yeah, the Willy Wonka.
Right. Although, maybe wasn't really helping them so much.
Well, no, he
all.
wasn't. He was exploiting them. Yeah.
But then the fact that, once Superman arrives on the scene and finally is able to win the people over and inspire them, that they're no longer looking up to him, but looking up to Superman. I think that, that was really cool. We didn't talk about For All Seasons a ton, but, as I said at the top, there's a lot of Smallville in that. I mean, the first issue is about him leaving and going out into the world, and he comes back in the second issue when he's feeling lonely, and he returns in the final issue after his run-in with Lex, and he's feeling doubt, and he kind of needs to rediscover his purpose. I've often thought about why the Smallville portion resonated with me so much, but I feel like it goes back to Superman the movie, because that was really the first time that I had that exposure, and as best I can remember, even then, that was something that I really identified with for whatever reason. I don't know. And then, of course, Smallville, the TV series, definitely played a large role in that. But I think ultimately, for me, what it comes down to, and I talked about this in a previous podcast, but the way I look at it, the Clark on the farm, Clark in Smallville, that's the truest version of the character. And when you get Clark the reporter and you get Superman, there's an element of disguise with both, and it can take, whether he's bumbling or he's assertive or he's dull, there's still some element of disguise, or he can't fully be himself. And even when he's Superman, he's wearing the costume, he's become that symbol for people. But I feel like Clark on the farm is the truest, purest version of himself, just like Bruce in the Batcave. Although you might argue Batman is the true version, but I kind of have that Trinity view of him too, where Bruce in the Batcave is really the truest version, and then there's that element of disguise with both Bruce Wayne, Playboy, and Batman. So maybe that's why the Smallville piece of all of this has always grabbed me the way it has.
Well, you're right. He is depicted in these stories as his most honest when he is in Smallville. And it's interesting for me personally, because over the last few years, Smallville has had very little to do with the Superman comics, which have been excellent, by the way. What Peter Tomasi and Patrick Gleason and Dan Jurgens were doing with Rebirth was really terrific. Really felt very much in the vein of what John Byrne, Marv Wolfman, and of course Jurgens himself was doing 20 years ago. It really felt right, and it's part of why I, in today's comics, really enjoy his relationship with his son and his relationship with Lois, and the fact that they brought that back in, because now, whether they're living in Hamilton County, which is a stand-in for Smallville, or moving to Metropolis, which is where they belong and they should be living, we do get to see him unvarnished. We get to see him as a person, because he doesn't have to hide himself with his wife and his son. We all have different faces that we present to the world, whether it's at work, whether it's with friends, whether it's with our spouses or family members. We do present ourselves in different ways. So to see him at his most unvarnished is always interesting to see, because you do get that that heart of Superman. So I could see why Smallville would be appealing for that reason. For me, we see that now in Metropolis with his nuclear family. But I can understand why the Smallville part of it would be that appealing. I just happen to I as someone who works in Manhattan, even today, if I'm walking, on a sunny day crossing Fifth Avenue, I still like to imagine, flying down the avenue like that. Superman and Metropolis to me are it's a quote that's usually attributed to Denny O'Neil, that New York City is, Metropolis is New York City in Midtown on a sunny May day, and Gotham City is New York City downtown on a cold November night. And it really fits. And as someone who finds himself in Midtown a lot, I still, New Yorkers aren't supposed to look up at the skyscrapers. It's supposed to be something that you don't do. I don't care. I love looking up, because I love imagining the idea of a Superman swooping around.
Well, that's a beautiful sentiment. And is there anything else that you wanted to say?
No, not really. I mean, as a guy who is a Batman guy, Superman is definitely second in my, second or third, maybe, depending. There might be a time where I like a certain character more because of their comic. I could make a case for, a few different heroes, but Superman is usually, comes into that number 2 spot. Do I like all of the stories? No. I do feel like right now he's in excellent hands, and I have really, really been enjoying what I've been reading over the last couple of years. And so far, what I've read of Bendis has been good too. But it just, again, looking over these 5 stories, the Man of Steel, even though it definitely has some cracks in it that you see after 30 years, I still return to it as being kind of like the primal, in the same way that Birthright is your Superman.
Sure, exactly.
It's the Man of Steel is mine.
Well said. I honestly, I had such a good time doing this.
Yeah, this was great.
Sincerely,
Yeah,
I really had a lot of fun.
Yeah.
This has been a really long day, and I don't know. I didn't know if I'd have the energy, but it's really been a lot of fun. I hope listeners enjoyed. I'm assuming if you're listening to this, you've read these stories, but maybe not. And if you haven't, I really do encourage you to read all of them. I think they each have their own flavor, and they each offer something. And what Man of Steel was to you or what Birthright was to me, one of these other stories might be to you listening to this.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, you mentioned that we haven't really talked as much about For All Seasons because in a sense, it's not really an origin story per se. It just amplifies some of the themes that we saw in Man of Steel, but it also works as well with the other stories. It's just a wonderful story.
Yeah.
It's beautifully told and it's wonderfully illustrated. And again, the colors are just absolutely gorgeous, but there's not a dog in this bunch.
Yeah, absolutely. Agreed. Well, I want to thank you very much for being part of this.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
I want to thank everyone for listening. So Dan and I are going to be back in 2 weeks.
Yes.
For the second part of the Superman Book Club event, and we're going to be talking about Bendis' Man of Steel. So that should be a lot of fun. Be sure to come back for that. Dan and I are going to keep talking for a few more minutes here. We're going to record an episode of the After Show. And on that note, if you want access to that, and why wouldn't you, sign up for the My Comic Shop History Patreon. It is live today, Wednesday, June 27th. I talked about it in the previous episode, and I've been posting about it, but in case you're not familiar, Patreon is a platform that allows creators to get paid for the work that they do. So I'm launching this page in exchange for becoming a member. You'll be getting exclusive content ranging from a full-length bonus episode of the show each season to these after-show episodes. I'll be doing one for each regular episode that we do, so it'll be a lot of additional exclusive content. You won't be able to get it anywhere else. So for those of you who have done that or are thinking about it, I thank you very much. I hope you enjoy. And, thank you to everyone for being part of this journey and for listening and supporting this flat squirrel operation here. So Dan and I are going to keep talking. Again, to get that after show, head on over to patreon.com/mycomicshophistory. And then we'll be back here in 2 weeks. I'm going to end this book club episode the way I end the book club episodes with a different Odoism. Not don't be a flat squirrel, though that's good advice, and you should always adhere to that. But my sign off for this will be keep your expectations low, and you'll never be disappointed.